Hi everyone, it's December 19th, 2025, and this is Erika. This is Bernando's oldest grandchild. How are you? How are you today? How are you doing during this holiday season? So this is a special edition that we have this evening. We've been doing these monthlies, and I was inspired to just take a little walk down memory lane. Oh, Cindy's here. Hi, Cindy. So I hope that your holiday is going well. And behind me is a very sparkly Christmas tree. We've got a lot of holiday decorations up here. It's very, very festive in here, which is nice to have all these lights, especially since it gets dark so early. Merry Christmas to you too. It's so nice that you showed up for this evening. So it is already December 19th, 2025, and it is the 10th anniversary of Bernando crossing over, dying, right? Going to another dimension. And it just got me to thinking that it would be nice to take a little trip down memory lane and share with you what it was like to spend the holidays with Bernando, and try and, I guess, give a little, recap or closure as to, what the last days were like spending with him. But I don't want to make this, something morbid per se. But it was certainly an honor and a privilege being with Bernando, about the last month of his life, the last month and 3 days of his life. So that's the premise that we're going on today. Of course, realizing that it was probably going to be the last Christmas that we were spending together, I took the opportunity to ask him different questions and things that I had just never really asked him before. Because, when you have grandparents or you have your loved ones around, you kind of think they're going to be around forever. And in my case, I was lucky enough to have a grandfather who lived to be 114 years old, it really did seem like he was going to be around forever. So just to encourage you that if you have any loved ones in your lives, and there's any questions you want to ask them, because once they're gone, you're not going to be able to ask them anything. Okay, so I actually spent about an hour and a half writing down different memories and different notes that I have, and I will try and get to all of it as best I can, as referring to my notes. And then I've also found a very cool photograph today that I had kind of forgotten about, even though it's actually in the beginning of this book, Age Less, Live More, Achieving Health and Vitality at 107 Years and Beyond, which of course is Bernando's classic book. And then I actually found the photo in person. So, okay, well, let me get into it. Christmas, holidays. Bernando loved to spend time with his family. That was a top priority for him. He would say that often. He would say that, his priority, that he wanted to spend as much time with his family as possible. So who was his family? Well, there was his daughter. Actually, he had two daughters. He had my mother, Lee Chamberlain, whose real name, non-stage name, she was named Alberta. His other daughter, Nandra, and his wife. Hi, Jamie. His wife, Bernando was married. Bernando was married 3 times, actually. But his wife, whoever that happened to be at that time, of course, in his younger years, it was one person. In his later years, it was another person. His wife, Georgette, they were married. They were together for 50 years. His first wife, as you may or may not know, actually died in childbirth because he had a son named Philip, or his nickname was Peña. And then he had 2 daughters with his second wife. And then with Georgette, you know, he didn't have any children. They were a little old to be having children at that point, since they got together in their middle age. But all that being said, he loves spending time with his family. And of course, the holidays is a great time to spend with your family. So Thanksgiving and Christmas were the big ones, and we would travel to see him. So it was also a wonderful way for him to express his love through cooking. Of course, Bernando was a trained chef. He loved to cook, and he loved, of course, to cook for his family when he had the opportunity to do that. And he would make everything from scratch. He would pretty much make everything from scratch, except I think maybe the cranberry sauce. He wouldn't necessarily make that from scratch, but everything else he made from scratch. So although Bernando ate moderately himself, you would never catch him overeating at Thanksgiving or at Christmas or really anywhere. He really pulled out all the stops in creating feasts for his family. So one of my earliest holiday memories are traveling by subway with my family, which would have been my brother Matthew and I, my mom and my dad, when he was living with Georgette in Jackson Heights, Queens. So I grew up in Manhattan. I grew up in New York City. So as you know, there are 5 different boroughs to New York City. There's Manhattan, there's Queens, there's Brooklyn, the Bronx, and there's Staten Island. And Bernando lived at 72-10 41st Avenue in Jackson Heights, Queens. So that's where we would go. So that was always an exciting prospect because he was so wonderful to be around. So when we got there, the apartment was already decorated in this red, white, and black theme because this happened to be Georgette's favorite colors. So in a way, it was already set up for Christmas. I remember they had this plastic tree. And so Georgette would just put, you know, Christmas lights on that, and that would be the Christmas tree. They wouldn't actually go out and drag a tree in. And then she would hang up mistletoe, which my brother would stand on underneath as a little kid, and then he would get, you know, a kiss from Georgette. And then the dining table. So the dining table and sort of around the dining table would have like little wreaths and little Christmas wreaths, you know, those kind of little wreaths that you put on the table, red candles on the table, and so forth. So, you know, back in the 1970s, this is where we would go for holidays because nobody cooked like him. And as I said, somehow he managed to crank out so much food out of that little kitchen. So if you've ever been to New York City, you know, we don't really have a lot of room here in general in our apartments unless you're, you know, very wealthy and you happen to have a very spacious apartment, let's say on Park Avenue, where the kitchens are very large and the rooms are very large. But in general, in New York City, the kitchens can be very, very small. But in his case, it was almost kind of like a galley, and there was a little kitchen table in there. But somehow he managed to crank out all this food. And I distinctly remember one year Grandpa serving us homemade soufflés made out of turnips. He made us turnip soufflés. I remember him standing up. You know, we were all sat around the table. The table had been expanded. He had opened it up and then added an extra leaf. So all, you know, 6 of us could sit around the table comfortably. But he not only did all the cooking from scratch, he also insisted on serving us all, which I just found amazing. So let's say in 1977, which would have been our last Christmas there, and here's a photo of us. There you see Georgette here, Bernando here, there's my mother here, myself there, and then my brother cracking up down in the corner. He was already, what, about 76 years old at this point? Didn't look it. I mean, look at him. Look at him. He looks like a man in his 40s, right? Anyway, so he had made these little souffles, you know, in the little souffle dishes, and was insisting on serving us as we sat around the table, because he would serve everything in courses, as you would learn to do in France, right? And I just remember thinking, well, you know, Grandpa, don't you want to sit down? He's like, oh, no, you sit down. I'm going to serve you. He took pleasure in doing this. He was great at hospitality, even if it was, quote, just his family. So, let me see. So I don't know about you, but I was never a fan of turnips. And I believe this was the first souffle that I'd ever had. I was like, wow, you know, this is something that you get served in restaurants. You know, I was just so impressed with him. And he had a magic touch in the kitchen. So even though I can't say I was fond of turnips and never had a souffle before, because turnips to me were, you know, were bitter things that didn't really have any particular, they weren't appealing. Let's just say they weren't appealing. No particular taste, maybe even a little on the bitter side. And they were absolutely delicious. And I remember asking him again and again, I was like, you made these, Grandpa? Yes, of course I made it. These are turnips? These are turnip souffles? How did you do this? So, of course, he explained to me how he did the souffle, which none of it has stuck in my brain. And I've just thought that that was amazing, just this magic touch that he had for cooking. And mind you, he wouldn't taste anything when he was cooking it. He was able to do everything by eye, you know, by the smell, by the look, you know, of it. He was very, very talented in that way. Not everyone is, but he was. So, needless to say, I haven't had a souffle since, let alone a turnip souffle. I've never seen anyone since attempt to serve or make a turnip souffle. So, what else was on the table at Thanksgiving, for example? So, there would be, of course, sweet potatoes, you know, the traditional things that you would expect, right? You sort of have like sweet potatoes or candied yams, although I don't recall him putting marshmallows on it. And then you would have, you know, he would make a mac and cheese, and then you would have your vegetables, right? Your green vegetables, the stuffing. He would make a turkey, and then, you know, he would serve this all until we were satisfied. Okay. You know, the gravy boats, everything in the proper dishware and the dishes. He was very, very conscientious about all those things because he was trained in the culinary arts. The other funny thing, of course, was, well, actually, Georgette didn't cook, so Georgette wasn't even allowed in the kitchen. My grandfather was the king of the kitchen. Again, he had been trained as a chef, and he was used to having his own way, and for God's sake, don't go in there unless you want to get in trouble. Just like a lot of people that are cooking, because they've got something going and they have to maintain their concentration. Okay, so when I was thinking about this brought to mind another memory that my own mother, you know, Alberta, as she was called as a child before she changed her name to Lee Chamberlain, about her memories of eating in their home, but also the fact that when Grandpa would come home, because my mother was born in 1938, okay? So these memories that she's drawing from are probably from the 40s, right? The late 40s and the 50s. So because Bernando worked as a seaman, right? He worked at sea. He worked on, you know, different kind of like steamliners, or sort of these luxury types of cruises and things like that, where people obviously needed to eat and needed to dine. And when he would go on these cruises, you know, he could be gone for a month or 2 or 3. So he told me that he always made sure that the pantry, you know, that the kitchen was well stocked and full of food before he left, because he was concerned, you know, that his family had enough to eat and wouldn't run out of food while he was away making a living at sea. But once he was home and went into the kitchen to cook for his family, he would use every single pot and pan in the kitchen. I was like, really? Everything? She says, oh yeah, the kitchen would be a mess after your grandfather was done in there, because remember, he was used to being a chef. He was used to working in a professional kitchen. And when you work in a professional kitchen, you have, you know, the sous chefs, you've got a full staff in there, and then of course you have the dishwasher. The chef himself, at least in those days, never washed the dishes. That was already someone else's responsibility. So he didn't think about it. So this is what he would do, which of course didn't make grandma too happy, although the food would be fantastic. Now, the other thing that she told me was when they were sitting down at the table, no, they would drink water. They would be given glasses of water to drink, no soda pop and none of that type of thing. But they were not permitted to drink any water, any liquid, until the meal was over. So, of course, I chimed in. I was like, really? But what if you were thirsty? And my mother replied that Bernando had a very strict policy about that. The kids, they were not allowed to drink until the end of the meal. So I thought that was interesting. And then of course, I remembered that in this book, Age Less, Live More, there is a section here. Let me see if I can find this section here, which I believe that I read to you a couple of months ago about eating. Yes, Eat Less, Live More. So there's a passage here on page 141 where Bernando says, the ancient practice of Ayurveda, a type of medicine still common in India and elsewhere, states the following, quote, when eating, only 1/3 of the capacity of the stomach should be filled with food, 1/3 with liquid, and 1/3 should be left empty. This will aid in proper digestion and promote mental clarity. So, of course, these days, I remember another doctor, actually Dr. Wentz, who founded USANA Health Sciences, said that you shouldn't eat and drink all the time, because it kind of washes the nutrients out of your system, that you should keep these, you know, space this, so your body actually has time to digest the food that you are chewing, right, breaking down with your enzymes, and the stomach does the rest of it, and then those nutrients get to be absorbed in your body. Otherwise, you're cheating yourself from getting active, you know, getting the nutrients that you actually need. Oh, Rebecca's here. Hey, Rebecca. Thank you, Rebecca. Did you see the tree? Look. We actually have 3 trees in this apartment this year. We've got this big 6-foot tree. It's all artificial. Then we have another smaller tree that's on a pillar. And then in the dining room, there's another tree, a little tinfoil tree. It's a festival of trees here. Okay. So that's just a memory, like I said, about how Bernando was always, you know, he was doing it himself, but he was also trying to impress upon his children and impress upon his family the proper way, you know, to eat and digest food so you wouldn't mess up your digestive system, and that you would be able to absorb the proper nutrients, and as it's pointed out in the Ayurveda, this mental clarity. So even though I'm talking about these feasts that Bernando would make, around Thanksgiving and Christmas, he himself was very disciplined about his own intake and consumption of food at this time. So another memory that came up was a big Thanksgiving that we had was it Thanksgiving? Well, it was probably both. I think we had a Thanksgiving and we also had a big Christmas dinner down there in North Carolina when he moved down there. So he moved down there and he lived there for several years, and it was related to Georgette's health and the cost of living and all of that. But needless to say, we would all descend on it. So as my cousins and my aunt already lived there, so those were 3 people that were already there. Then my mother would arrive, I would arrive, and then my brother would arrive with his spouse, and then eventually there was a child added to that, Truman, his great-grandchild, and then sometimes there would be another spouse, there would be other people there, and then there would be the mother of the spouse that would be at the table, and then there would be various sort of extended family members or friends that would also be at the table. So one year I counted, and I was like, there was about 13 people at the table, and then of course Grandpa at the head of the table, and then I don't know if Georgette was sitting at the table with us. She was going through some health things, and she was actually not able to sit up, which I think I've talked about this before. She was not able to sit up and be with us at the table. So essentially, there were 15 people at this Thanksgiving Christmas / dinner, and Grandpa made everything from scratch, everything. So he was already well into, let's see, the last time we were there all together, he was in his late 90s at this point and had actually come out of retirement from being a chef. So he was actually working at a country club. And because he was working at a country club, he had access to the professional chafing dishes that you'll see when you go to a fancy buffet, where, you have the pan, then you've got the water underneath it, or if anyone's worked in catering, you know what I'm talking about. And then you've got the lid, and then you've got the little Bunsen burner that you light underneath ahead of time, and then that heats up the water. So when you bring out the dish of food, regardless of what it is, if it's rice or black beans or whatever it is, it stays warm. It doesn't get cool. So he put out this whole professional spread from us. And so that way each one of us could go to the buffet that he set up and serve ourselves food, and the food would remain hot. He was amazing like this. So somewhere I have a videotape, a VHS tape of, it was probably me, filming this entire meal, because it was amazing. Of course, Bernando thought I was crazy for doing this, but I was like, I don't think you realize how amazing you are and how amazing this whole spread is that you've done. So some of the foods that I remember that he prepared for this occasion, okay, I wrote it down here. Let me see. He prepared for us, okay, there we go. He prepared for us shrimp Creole. That was a seafood dish. He prepared black beans, no pork in that. He prepared rice. He prepared sweet potatoes. He prepared greens. I believe they were green beans. I think he had mac and cheese there, He had biscuits, right? He made biscuits. There was gravy. There was, of course, a turkey that he had baked, that he had roasted for everyone. That was stuffed with stuffing that he had prepared. And then I'm sure there were other things as well, but these are the things that like I really remember. And then there were all the desserts that he made from scratch. He made chocolate eclairs from scratch. He made cream puffs from scratch. He made a pecan pie from scratch. He made an apple pie because I asked for one at the last minute from scratch. He made a red velvet cake from scratch. He made a vanilla cake from scratch. And if I'm not mistaken, I seem to remember the fact that he made a chocolate mousse. So just let's count that. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. That's about 16 different food items that Bernando made by himself in his 90s in his home kitchen in Lexington, North Carolina for us. And don't go in the kitchen. Don't go in the kitchen. And what are you doing in my kitchen? Get out. We're like, okay, Grandpa. Okay, Grandpa. He did not want anyone in the kitchen while he was cooking. So now it's time to eat. We've all gone to the buffet and we've served ourselves what we want. We all sit around the table. We say grace and then we start eating. And I was not that far away from Grandpa. I think there was like probably about 4 people down because basically all the grandkids sat on one side of the table. And I looked at him. He was just sitting there. He was just sitting there at the back of the table, and he was kind of there like that, and just kind of looking at us eating. And I said, I noticed he didn't have a plate. And I said, well, Grandpa, aren't you hungry? Aren't you going to eat with us? I mean, usually, the whole family eats together. He said, I already ate. You did? Oh, yeah. I eat at my regular time. I think he had said he'd eaten about 5 o'clock. See, 5 or 6 o'clock. We eat around 5 o'clock. I was like, oh, okay, And he just sat there and watched us eat. And then actually, this is a funny thing. I guess he was a little tired, after this. He was a little, he wasn't really a grouchy person, but my brother and my cousin, Vincent and me and Maeve, it's like we went up there. I mean, we must have helped ourselves to food, like 2 or 3 times. Not kidding, right? And then everyone else. And I remember him leaning back and saying, how come no one's eating anything? How come no one's eating anything? I was like, what? I was like, Grandpa, we are eating things. We've been up there. This is like the 3rd time we've like served ourselves three times up there. So it just goes to show you that whether you're Bernando Lapallo or not, the cook wants to see you eat and they want to see you eat all the food. Otherwise they get mad. So, I just thought it's so funny. And that was just like the main stuff, right? Then we still had all the desserts to eat afterwards. So, incredible. But what I wanted to point out here is that his discipline in not eating again just because we were, right? He did everything for us. He did it out of love. He did everything from scratch. I mean, he was so quick in the kitchen. I remember when I was looking at the desserts, looking at the red velvet cake and looking at the pecan pie, looking at the sweet potato pie and looking at the vanilla cake and looking at the cream puffs and looking at the chocolate eclair. What did the granddaughter say, right? I said, there's no apple pie, Grandpa? And he goes, is that what you want, baby? You want an apple pie? I'll make you an apple pie. And he did. I mean, he got the apples, he made the pie crust, and within 45 minutes or so, ding, he made me an apple pie. Just because I asked for it. This is amazing. No thing for him. He had actually, it's in storage right now, but I actually have a trophy that he received for excellence in baking. So he could do anything, and he could do it with such expertise. Okay, so getting back to the point here, he did not overeat. He never overate, and that his discipline, his custom, his habit that he maintained throughout his entire life was he would always eat at a regular time, regardless of whether he was invited to a friend's home, like Mara, for example, who was throwing a big, sort of a birthday party dinner for him. He would eat at his regular time. Because let's say the party wasn't called for until 7 o'clock, right? And then you weren't going to sit down at the table at 8 o'clock. He would not jeopardize his schedule and wait for 3 hours to eat later than usual, because he used to say, when you're accustomed to eating at a regular time, if you don't eat at that time, your body starts to produce different acids. Your stomach is there waiting for you to feed it, and then nothing comes, right? And then this produces all kinds of, acids and stuff in your stomach, and then it can throw you off. So he never did that. Now, it's not that he didn't eat anything while he was at this birthday celebration, right? Just to come full circle here. But it was very, very moderate what he ate. Very, very moderate. Okay. So, yeah, he didn't change his schedule for anyone or anything. So I think there's a lesson here to learn, or sort of an insider's tip on how to regulate your eating, especially during the holidays, because we know what it's like. We get invited to cocktail parties and office parties and get-togethers and eating, drinking, snacking. And, that can start from the end of October, and then you go through November, through Thanksgiving, and then you go through the Christmas holidays, and then, of course, there's the big, bang, New Year's Eve, right? And before you know it, you've gained 10, 15, 20, 25 pounds by the time you get to the end of the season. So this is a tip. So he explained to people, and I remember him explaining it to people at his 114th birthday party at Mara's house, that he always stuck to his schedule. And so that way, you won't be eating a lot of empty calories, all those corn chips and potato chips and little cakes and things like that. Of course, Bernando wasn't a fanatic. He would always say moderation. He would even sometimes joke and say you should even be moderate about your moderation. But the point is, you're not eating off hours, and you're not depending on having corn chips and, let's say, onion dip for your dinner, party after party after party after party. So this is just a way that when you go, you're already satisfied, and that, any little snacks or anything that you have is just sort of icing on the cake, as it were. It's not your main meal. So that's a takeaway for that, and you might want to try that out this holiday season, and see how you do when you cross the finish line at New Year's Eve. Okay, so I wanted to talk about, let me see, some other things I want to talk about some other things. So I wanted to talk about the days leading up to Christmas in 2015. I was determined to create a festive atmosphere in the apartment that we were staying in together. The lease was in Bernando's name at 114, and he had procured us a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment that had a kitchen and a living room, sort of, kind of a living room, dining room situation. The location was on I think it was Beldemar Drive, and we were in Tempe, Arizona. And, right down the street, there was a dry cleaners, and there was a Trader Joe's, and, all those little things. There was a CVS. It was in walking distance. And he said, I like this neighborhood because I can walk to the dry cleaners. I can walk to the store. I can walk to the drugstore, whatever. I can walk to everything that I need. So he appreciated that, and he did do that. So at any rate, because I kind of knew that this was going to be our last holiday together, and it was just me and him, while my cousins weren't there and all of that, my brother wasn't there, it was just me and him, I was determined to make this into a festive occasion as something to look back on and cherish. So with my friend Morel Inglefield, who works at Phoenix Magazine. She does wonderful work over there at Phoenix Magazine. If any of you are living in the Phoenix, Mesa, etc. area, and because she had a car, because I didn't have a car, because she had a car, we drove off and we went over to Lowe's, I believe, and we picked up a reasonably sized Christmas tree, and we dragged it into the house together. And Grandpa was there when we came in. He was sitting in his lazy boy chair. I think he was maybe watching, television. And I told him that we were going to go out to get a tree, but I don't think he really believed me. So when we came back with the tree, he was like, "What are you doing?" He was kind of grouchy about it. Like, what are you doing? And I said, "It's Christmas, Grandpa. Of course I got a tree. I got a tree. I'm going to decorate the tree." So there we were, me and Morel, kind of sitting on the floor, kneeling, trying to get the tree into the tree stand and get it up and all of that. While Bernando, Grandpa, was kind of razzing us. He was kind of hassling us a little bit about getting the tree and all of that. So, which was kind of amusing. Morel kind of found it amusing. Hi, Conrad, and hi, Jean. We found it kind of amusing, that he was being kind of grouchy about this. So we just kept on doing what we were doing and setting up the tree. So a few nights later, he set up the tree. Morel hung out for a little while, and then she went off, and I had pulled out all the Christmas decorations because I had all the Christmas decorations in the garage. And I spent a considerable amount of time decorating the tree. Somewhere I've got a photo of that tree. I'll see if I can find the photo of that tree and put that up. So I remember, a few nights later, after Grandpa giving me such kind of a hard time about this whole thing, that he came out and he looked at the tree, and then his whole mood changed and he was very thoughtful. And he said that it was probably the most beautiful Christmas tree that he'd ever seen. And I was like, "Oh, that's nice of you to say, Grandpa." And he said, "No, I mean it. It's really one of the most beautiful trees I've ever seen." And then, of course, he went down the hallway and he went to bed. Because Grandpa was usually in bed by, 8 o'clock at night. He got up very early in the morning. He got up at like 5 o'clock in the morning and did his whole routine and his exercise and his walking and his superfood and whatever activities he had during the day or speaking engagements and all of that. So by the time 8 o'clock rolled around, he was ready to go to bed, and that's what he did. He didn't stay up late just because I was there. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what Bernando's days were like before he passed away on December 19th of 2015. Again, this is the 10th anniversary today of Bernando passing away. It's hard to believe. But at any rate, he had actually been invited out to go see a production of a play called Black Nativity. Black Nativity was written by Langston Hughes, and Langston Hughes was a very prominent writer and poet that was very popular and thrived. He's still well known today, but he was very popular and thrived during the Harlem Renaissance. And of course, Bernando had grown up in Harlem and New York City. So he went to go see that. He was picked up by his friends in a chauffeured car. And of course, he was dressed to the nines. He was wearing a very nice blue suit. He was wearing, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that he was wearing kind of a matching blue tie. He had on his Stacey Adams shoes, and he had a walking stick or a cane that he called his third leg. That was kind of a bluish and purplish number with a little wooden handle. So he was color coordinated, he was looking sharp, and he was ready to go to the theater, which he did. And of course, this is the old school way. No one really dresses up for things like this anymore, but when my grandfather was coming up, people certainly did. Going out was a special occasion, and you dressed up for it. So I remember, I stayed at home. I wasn't invited to this event. It didn't even occur to me, to want to go to this event. And he had his own social life, So I was waiting up for him when he got home. And I remember thinking, wow, it's kind of late, Because again, like I said, normally Bernando was in bed, by 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. If he'd been out making a speech, but generally he was in bed pretty early. So when the door finally swung open at 10 o'clock at night, I was like, oh, there you are. I was wondering, when you were coming home. And he was accompanied actually by a friend. Her name was Francine, because she'd never seen the apartment before, and he'd only been there for, a few months, and of course he wanted to give her a tour of the apartment. So I just sat there. I was like, hi, Francine. So I just sat there on the couch, as he very proudly showed her around the apartment, this bedroom, that bedroom, the bathrooms, the living rooms, all the closets, all of that. And then spent quite a lot of time showing her the collection of family photographs that, of course, that were displayed up on the wall. So that would have been his daughters, his granddaughters, his grandsons, his wife, all of that, and some friends. He was very, very proudly showing that. Bernando, he really loved his family, and he was always happy, to show, like any proud parent or grandparent or great-grandparent, the photographs of his family. So that's what he did. And, after some small talk and everything, Francine excused herself. I believe she called the cab, and off she went. So now it's about 10:30 at night, and he sits down, in the chair, and I'm sitting on the couch, and I said, well, how was it? Did you have a nice time? How was the theater? So he told me how wonderful it was and what a nice time he had, and how he'd seen this person and how he'd seen that person, and he hadn't seen them in a while, and how nice it was to see them. Of course, he had wonderful social skills and how wonderful the play was. I believe the play was being performed in Scottsdale. There's a theater over there that I can't quite recall the name. It might just be called the Scottsdale Theater. It might be something as simple as that. That's where they went and how lovely it was. And I was like, that's wonderful. And then, we stayed up actually for quite a bit of time talking. We talked and talked and talked, and I was inspired to ask him different questions that I had just never asked him before. So I asked him about how he actually, sort of what was the turning point, or what was it that really got him into the culinary arts? Because, of course, his father was an MD. His father was a doctor. And, in fact, Bernando's father wanted him to be a doctor, but Bernando didn't want to be a doctor. And kind of how his whole, journey into becoming a professional chef came about. So he shared with me a couple of things that night, which I wrote down and I took notes on. Right? I wrote this stuff down while we were sitting there. So he explained to me that a few things. One was they had servants. They lived on Strivers Row up in Harlem. And they had servants. They had a houseboy. And they also had Margaro. Now, Margaro was an Irish lady. And, she did the cooking and the cleaning and sort of the housekeeping because my great-grandfather was a busy professional man. He was basically he was raising Bernando himself. Bernando would visit his mom, but basically my great-grandfather had a very specific idea of how Bernando should be raised, and he was going to be raised that way. I'm glad I wrote things down too, Cindy, because you think you're going to remember things, and then 10 years or 15 years go by, and you don't remember in the way that you think you were going to. So because they were divorced, right, and Bernando Sr. wanted to raise Bernando Jr., my grandfather, in a particular way. There wasn't a hostile relationship there, but he put his foot down, Bernando Sr., and he said, no, I'm going to raise my son in a particular way. So I said, okay, so the conversation that he had with his dad, he said, my daddy, he'd always call his dad, daddy. He said, my daddy asked me one day, what do you think you'd like to be? Talking to him about had he considered a career path. Well, Daddy, since you asked me, I think I'd like to be a chef. And then he said to me, my daddy wanted me to be a doctor, but he said I didn't want to be a doctor. So his father said, a chef? What do you want to be a chef for? All that standing around, moving from place to place. If you're a doctor, patients come to you. You don't have to travel, they come to you. So Bernando said, well, Daddy, since you asked me, I want to be a chef. Now, I think they're having this conversation. I'm going to speculate they're having this conversation when Bernando is maybe like 14 years old or so. So his father said, all right, let me think about it. So Bernando says the next day he came to me and said, you are what you eat. You took my words and threw them right back in my face. What do you mean by that, Daddy? Bernando said. And he said, well, his father said, well, if you feed your body properly, you will not get sick. You have the opportunity with the earth and all the good food that comes through the earth to cook for people of all walks of life. You can use the herbs and the vegetables. You'll be a doctor of the intestines. I think this conversation is amazing. So, parents usually have an idea of what they want their children to be, quote, when they grow up. And as it turns out, Bernando's father, my great-grandfather, was no different than the average parent and wanted Bernando to be a medical doctor because he knew that he'd make a good living that way. And also, again, he wouldn't have to go here and there, right? The patients would come to him. Because my great-grandfather had his own cabinet, as they say in French, his own medical practice, right in the same building in which they lived, in Harlem, right? So I just thought it was a great answer. So essentially, Bernando, explained to me over time that when he would see his father, for example, packing up his medicine bag to go see a patient, his father would put like an onion in the medicine bag. He'd put a cabbage in the medicine bag. And Bernando would say to him, he was younger then, he would say to them, are these people hungry? Why are you putting food in the bag to see these people? And his father would laugh and say, oh no, this is medicine, right? So remember, Hippocrates said, let food be thy medicine. Let food be thy medicine. So a very different way of thinking about food. And of course, I've talked before about how onions are good for getting rid of the common cold, and how cabbage can be good, for example, for getting rid of the swelling on an arthritic knee, and so on. So, all these things, that Bernando was observing, and that Bernando was learning and internalizing from his father, came into play when he made his final decision about his career path. Now, another person that was influential in Bernando deciding what his career path was, again, was Margaro. As I had mentioned previously, Margaro was an Irish woman, and she took care of the housekeeping around there and the cooking. And they had a close relationship. So he would watch Margaro cook. So I quote, Margaro turned me on to it. She would let me watch her in the kitchen, and I'd ask her why she did this, why she did that. I remember asking her a question one time. So now Bernando at this point, he's about 12 or 13 years old, and he's hanging out in the kitchen and he's watching Margaro, their servant, cooking in the kitchen. So he says to Margaro, Daddy says all the flavor, all the nutrients are in the vegetables. I said, why did you pour the water off and pour all the nutrients down the sink? She replied she couldn't tell him why, that she only did as she saw her grandmother do, and that if he wanted answers, that he should go to school. And apparently, her nickname for Bernando was Professor. She'd say, go on, Professor. Go on, Professor. So she got him to thinking, wow, I could actually go to school and learn how to cook, and learn how to cook perhaps in a way to preserve the nutrients. Actually, he told me that he came up with the idea of steaming vegetables by watching Margaro, and that he actually directed her, hey, let's try this. Instead of putting so much water, in the green vegetables, let's just put a little in and steam them and see how that comes up. So he was already thinking about how to approach cooking at a very young age, at like 12 or 13. Now, there's one other person that he told me about that was influential in helping him think about going into a career in the culinary arts. So there was a patient. Now I've written it down here as John. Okay, there was a guy named John who was a patient of Bernando Lapallo Sr., of my great-grandfather. He also happened to be a cook. So I think he was probably working for a wealthy family somewhere, because people have private cooks just like they do today. And so Bernando used to shoot the breeze with, oh, I see his name is Wilson. Ah, okay, I wrote down Wilson. He used to shoot the breeze with Wilson in the patient waiting room. And they talk about cooking. He said we'd always have a good conversation. I said to him, I want to be a chef, and if I could ask you some questions, that would really help me out. It's like a little Bernando, right? And I said, so how old were you then, Grandpa? What age were you when you were grilling Wilson about cooking? And he said, I was about 10 years old. So basically, Wilson said to him, oh yeah, it's good that you ask questions at this age while your brain is still young. And it's still, sort of, well, he wouldn't use the word plastic, like we use today, like plasticity, because that way you'll remember. These things will stick in your memory and stick in your brain, as you get older. So I was just talking to a friend the other day about how we underestimate children and their ability and their intelligence to grasp things and grasp concepts, and that we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't do that to children. As a matter of fact, the friend that I was having this conversation with said to me, you know, as a child, I noticed how shut down a lot of adults were, and how they didn't really think, and they didn't really think things clearly, as opposed to, as she was speaking for herself, when I was a child, I was very curious, and I wanted to know things, and I wanted to know answers to things. And sometimes when I would ask an adult a question, it was very frustrating for me because they couldn't answer the question, because they hadn't thought about it. They just were kind of doing things, you know, by route and by, you know, kind of as a zombie. So this makes me think of two things. One, the fact that Bernando always remained curious. He was always reading. He loved talking to people. He was a very good listener. He loved listening and hearing what people had to say. And he had an amazing book collection. He was always picking up new books and reading new books and taking courses and learning different things. I mean, the proof is he had, what, four different careers during the course of his lifetime? And the other thing it makes me think of, too, was how Bernando would say that it's important to start training children when they're young in the proper ways to eat, right? So he says if you get them, you know, when they're young, right, that way they form these good habits at a young age, and they don't get caught up in eating junk food or drinking soda pop and all that stuff. And of course, we know diabetes is a huge epidemic in this country, and especially in children that are so young, because their parents do not train them in the right way, you know, and how to eat and when to eat and how to chew their food and these different things. So just look at Bernando and what an influential person he became and still is, just because of the way his father molded him and taught him how to eat. And then he became a chef, and then eventually he'd write a couple of books on that. And then, of course, wow people, you know, with his own example, just with his own vitality and his own being. So I just want to show this picture again for anyone who's just tuning in now, because I see Beverly is here, and Alyssa Marie is here, and John D is here, and Lisa is here, and Taurus Connie is here, and of course Cindy Larson is here, and Conrad Barnes is here, and Jean Woods is here, and Rebecca Soprano is here. I know people will be watching this later, but if you look at this photo, this is Bernando. This is me at 14, right? This is Bernando. My brother's goofing off here. He's probably about 11 or so. This is Georgetta's wife. That's my mom. So this means in 1977, Bernando was already 76 years old. Does that look like a 76-year-old man to you? And what you expect? His skin is beautiful. He has his hair. In fact, he's sporting a mustache. He doesn't have a big belly, right? Look at that smile. Look at that smile. Okay. All right. Let me see. What else can I say here? Maybe someone's got a question, but I want to... Let me see, I want to refer back to my notes here. Okay, so again, I'm also just impressed with the very respectful relationship that Bernando had with his father, the very close bond that they had. It's just really incredible. And there wasn't a day when Bernando didn't think about his father. He would talk about his father all the time, all the time. And just how Bernando was able to, you know, sort of absorb and transmute these different ideas, which eventually he would turn into a professional career as a chef that would really last, you know, into his 70s before he got out of the restaurant business, because he was not interested in, in New York City, I should say. He was not interested in pouring frozen foods out of bags and frying them and doing all of that. He said to me, once you know how to do something the right way, it's very hard to do it the wrong way. So I think I'm going to get into something else. And I was like, wow, really, Grandpa? Because I knew how much he loved cooking. He said, yeah, I've been thinking about it. As a matter of fact, I remember going to see him. I was about 18 or so, and I actually had a little job as a waitress. And on the way home, I knew he was working at this joint across town, the East Side, so I decided to go see him and say hello, before I went home. And I still remember him, he was actually pouring, these fries into a thing, and he's like, I don't want to do this. So then he went on, of course, he went back to school. He went back to school, and he went to NYU. He studied reflexology. He renewed his podiatry license, and then before that, actually, he went to the Swedish Institute of Massage, and he got his massage license, and then he got his reflexology, got his certificate in that. He got his podiatry license on a dare, or just for fun, actually, because someone he was mentoring who got their massage license, she said, well, if I have to do that, then you have to learn hair and makeup, because there was this little school called Robert Finon's School of Hair and Makeup. So he went and got his certificate in hair and makeup at the age of 82. I actually have the certificate here. Amazing. So he had this whole career afterwards. So I guess I just want to speak briefly about his demise, I should say, which actually happened rather quickly. So basically, at the end there, Bernando was very lucid, and he started to realize different things about his state of health. Again, he dressed himself, he bathed himself, he wasn't in a wheelchair, he had a social life, he cooked for himself, he did all those things, but, he did notice that his short-term memory was going, and I think that bothered him. It did bother him, because he told me that he never wanted to be a burden on anyone. And he actually told me a funny story of when he was staying in this assisted living place that we got him out of there. Anyway, he overheard a nurse saying to another nurse, he said, well, when they get older, they become like children, so you have to be patient with them. You may have to repeat things, again and again. You have to be patient, because as people get older, they lose their memory and got to repeat things over and over again. And so he said, so you're going to have to be patient with me, he said. And I thought, who is this guy? This guy, my grandfather, is lucid about the fact that he's actually losing his short-term memory, and is telling me an anecdote about that to instruct me to be patient with him. Amazing. So I guess we all have to die of something, right? Or as my mother used to say, sometimes I would say to my mother, Alberta Lee, I would say, well, what did he or she die of? And she'd say, oh, well, they died of death, she would say, and kind of chuckle about it. So this is how I see Bernando's passing. So essentially, he was watching television one day in his lazy boy, and I came out, and I noticed that he began slurring his speech, essentially. He wasn't really, I knew that he thought he was answering me clearly, but he wasn't. And I thought, uh-oh, maybe this is like a stroke or something. Now, mind you, he's 114 at this point. So, of course, I call the ambulance, and we take him to the local hospital. I think it was Banning Medical Center. And, of course, by the time we get there, now he's kind of recovered, and he's clear again, and he doesn't understand why we're there. And I was like, well, Grandpa, I explained to him what happened. I thought, I just thought maybe it'd be a good idea to get you checked out, right? And, of course, he's now charmed everyone in the ambulance and everyone in the emergency room, and they're all amazed at him and how old he is and all of that, and he gets checked in, and I go home, but the doctor has my telephone number, and basically they want to keep him overnight, and they want to do some tests and stuff. So as it turns out, he had a little bladder infection. So when I spoke to the doctor, he said, that's quite a common thing. When people get older, they can get these little bladder infections. And sometimes what happens when they get the bladder infections is because of the, I guess the bacteria, that it can go to the heart and it can cause a little stroke. And that's basically what happened to your grandfather. He's basically good, but he had a little stroke. So I put him on some medication, some antibiotics, and some little medication, to get rid of the infection. I said, okay, great. And I said, well, how much longer, do you think he'll be in the hospital? He said, oh, just another night, then you can come home. I said, okay. So the next day, I get a call from the doctor. And I said, what's going on? And he said, well, your grandfather's trying to get out of the hospital. He doesn't want to stay here another night. And I said, of course he doesn't. Of course he doesn't. Because for one thing, Bernando was not a fan of the food, so-called food in the hospital. He didn't eat grilled cheese sandwiches and Jell-O and things like that. And he's accustomed to having his superfood and his oatmeal and all of that. And any of you guys have been to a hospital, maybe it's better now, but in general, the food isn't great. So he wanted to get the heck out of there. So I said, he basically said, what do you think? And I said, well, how's his blood pressure? Because his blood pressure was high, of course, from the bladder infection and all that. This is also normal that happens. And he said, well, it's still a little high. And I said, well, let's keep him in the hospital one more night and the medication and get things stabilized, because I don't want to bring him home and then his, blood pressure goes through the roof and then we got to go through this all over again. And he said, okay, that's what I thought. But, I wanted to ask, because your grandpa's pushing hard to get out of the hospital. So I said, okay, doc. So, I kind of hung up the phone, chuckled about that, because this was like classic Bernando, classic, right? So he did come home. Well, actually, I went to go pick him up. I went to go pick him up at the hospital the next day. And because the hospital was so huge, I mean, my goodness, was this hospital enormous. And because I think it was relatively new at the time and the markings weren't very clear, trying to find the wing that he was in the taxi, it took a little bit longer than expected. And so I was calling him, telling him that I'm on my way. And he's like, well, where are you? And I said, well, we're trying to find your wing and all of that. And he was getting impatient. And I was like, I'll be there as soon as I can, Grandpa. The pressure, right? So when I finally, found the wing that he was in, which was like all the way down practically at the end, and got to the hospital room, well, there he was. He was dressed. He was dressed and ready to go. He actually was just hanging up the phone because I was just about to call you again. I said, I'm sorry, Grandpa, I'm sorry. Sorry it took so long to find you. So, we got out of there and, we got him home and all of that. So basically what ended up happening was the next day, I was giving him his medications, which he did not like taking pills. But I said, look, the doctor says you got to take these antibiotics, and you got to take these medications, and, you got to do it. So he said, okay. He was actually very cooperative, He didn't fight me on it. Because I said he didn't like taking pills and all this type of thing. But he did it. And so he actually had a couple of social engagements on the 19th. So there was a nice lady and her mom that were coming over to pick up some superfood because they had run out. So they came to do that. And of course, he had been up late the night before, right? Because he had been to the play, The Black Nativity. We had stayed up talking till midnight, right? So he'd been to the hospital, felt better, was on the medication, went out, had a great time at the theater, which I've already explained earlier in this thing. And then we talked till midnight, and then the next morning, he actually wasn't up as early as he usually was. I didn't smell the oatmeal cooking, so I went back to check on him, and I said, "Are you all right, Grandpa?" He said, "Oh, yeah, I'm fine, just a little sleepy," because I said, "Yeah, well, you stayed up late last night," which is like, midnight for you is like, 3 o'clock in the morning for someone else. He's like, "Well, I'll be up." I checked on him again, and, he'd already taken a bath and was taking care of his cufflinks, and then came out and, all of that. And then I said, "Remember, your friends are coming over to socialize." And he said, "Well, I'm gonna make myself a cup of green tea because I'm feeling sleepy." Drank a lot of green tea, made his green tea. I was fiddling around doing whatever I was doing on the computer as usual. And then his friends came over and they socialized and all that. And then they left. And then not a half an hour, I don't think a half an hour go by when there was a knock on the door and some other people showed up. This other friend of his came by with his daughter because they'd heard that he'd been in the hospital and they were worried and they wanted to come by, and they brought a pecan pie and socialized. And then after about an hour, I kind of gave him the look, and I was like, "Listen, he's kind of tired and it's probably a good time for you to go. Thank you very much for coming, but he kind of needs some rest. I mean, he is 114 after all." And so they were like, "Okay," so they left, rather reluctantly, but I could understand, they left. And then Bernando went back to, just kind of relaxing and watching TV and, just kind of doing his routine. And I went into the bedroom to just do what I was doing as usual. And then, after a little while, I heard this sound, like he was clearing his throat. And then there's just something about it that made my ears prick up. And I was like, I think something's going on. So when I went back in there, I don't know if any of you have heard of something called the death rattle. So it's basically, when you're going to leave your body, when you're going to die, one of the things that can happen is that there can be a lot of mucus or whatever, it seems like, that can just sort of catch in the throat. So, people will try and clear the throat, and it kind of sounds like a rattle, at least in the Black community. And in old times, people would call this the death rattle. So I was like, oh my goodness. So I'm looking at him, and he's sitting in the chair, upright in the chair, good posture. His head is a little bit down like this, and he's got his fists clenched, on either thigh. And I'm like, oh my God. So I call the ambulance, and I, kind of explain what's going on. Well, actually, I look at him and I realize what's going on, right? And then, basically he has another little, basically kind of a heart attack, right? And I'm like, oh my God. So I call the ambulance. They say, "Don't worry, we're coming over. You do CPR on him until, the professionals arrive." And I'm like, okay, so, get him out of the chair, get him on the floor. The nice lady's explaining to me what I'm supposed to do. And so I'm giving him CPR, until the ambulance gets there. So the ambulance does get there. Oh my goodness. And when the ambulance gets there, it's just, God, what a disturbing thing it is. You kind of want, I kind of wanted something more peaceful because this is my grandfather, but like the door and the firemen and the radios, and they were nice guys, right? And then he's on the floor, so they cut the shirt open and then they put the electrodes on, and it's all this kind of drama, and I'm just standing there watching this whole thing. And then, of course, they're like, "We're going to take him to the hospital," right? I mean, I think pretty much he checked out at that point, but they did their due diligence. So they put him in the ambulance, and I got in another ambulatory vehicle to follow to the hospital. And then, they took him off to a room somewhere, and I waited there for about an hour until the doctor came out looking very, very sad. I mean, that poor man, how many times did he have to say this day? And he said, "I'm very sorry to tell you this, but your father, he was like my father to me, your grandfather is gone." Which was, wow, that was that was kind of devastating. And, you know, they allowed me to go in and look at him, you know, I say, and, you know, sort of say goodbye and all of that. So that was really something. So, you know, when I think back on it now, and when I think about just how people are in my family, particularly on my grandfather's side of the family, it seems like people basically decide when they want to leave. And a lot of people on that side of the family lived to be 100 or over 100 or 99, you know, like young on that side of the family was like 89, okay? Just to put it in perspective. So there's like a lot of centenarians, you know, in my ancestry. So when I think back, you know, on what he was saying about how he didn't want to be a burden on anyone, about how he realized how his memory was going, and then there was just a brief exchange we had, you know, really like the day before he kind of checked out, where he said to me, he said, "So you came here to live with me, to keep an eye on me, to make sure nothing would happen to me." And right? And I said, "Yes, that's right, Grandpa. That's right." And I think that he contemplated that and decided to leave. This is emotional. Because his whole philosophy was he didn't want to be a burden on anyone. As he used to say that the body was like a machine, like a car, like a vehicle. In Sanskrit, they call the body a yantra, which basically means a machine. The soul is a passenger in the body. This was his view. And he said, you know, I never want to be like, or, you know, broken down or having to have people do different things for me. You know, if I can't do them for myself, I don't want to be there. And actually, this is making me remember something else. So when we had been eating, right, dinner, and I got up, and, you know, because we were both finished, I got up, and so I picked up my plate, and then on my way to the kitchen, of course, I picked up his plate. That's how I was trained, right? And he said, don't do that for me. Don't take my, and I said, don't do what? He said, don't take my plate. And I said, well, Grandpa, I said, I was just going to the kitchen, so it just seemed normal that I should take your plate as well as I'm going to the kitchen. He said, you are my granddaughter, not my servant. You are my granddaughter, not my servant. Now that really struck me. And then he said, if you start doing things for me, then I will stop doing for myself. And then I will become lazy and I will lose my independence. So please, don't do things like that for me. Let me do it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is something that really stuck with me. It really, really stuck with me. Later on, when I was in another living situation, and the person that I was living with, you know, always wanted to take me everywhere by car. And one day I just said, I don't want to go by car. I want to go by myself. Well, don't you want, I said, it's not that. I said, but I don't want to lose my ability to walk. I don't want to lose my independence. I don't want to lose my ability to plan, to think about where I'm going and the things that I need to get there. I said, if I just keep doing this, then I'm going to become soft, you know? And so I have my grandfather to thank for even having that thought or having that thought process. So there you have it. I hope that you enjoyed this little talk. If you're watching this later here on Facebook, it's always great when you make a comment and say hello. If you're watching this on YouTube later on, which I'm going to upload this on YouTube later on, because if you have not subscribed to Age Less, Live More on YouTube, please do so. Because if you're watching this on Facebook, Facebook now has this storage policy where they delete all your videos after 30 days. So I have been posting these on YouTube so you can watch them later. So, you know, give this a like, give it a thumbs up. Does anyone have any questions? I'm just going to scroll through here to see if anyone has any. Joshua's here. Iselina's here. Clem is here. Let's see who's here. Katina is here. Omar is here. Grace is here. Chris is here. Ishna is here. Nikki is here. Leon is here. Anjula is here. Shirley is here. Who else? Thank you so much. Oh, you're welcome, Joshua. Mais je vous en prie, Joshua Gautreau. I really appreciate you being here. So I hope that you got something out of this. If you tuned in a little late, go back and watch it because there's some great tips in here. Basically how to get through the holiday season without overeating, a la Bernando. I really appreciate you. I appreciate every book, you know, that you pick up and that you share with others. As always, I will post the important links. Also, I wanted to say I am aware that I have not reposted Bernando's daily menu and regime because I'm trying to think of a way to do it that's more visual and that serves you all better visually. That's sort of easier to you know, retain the information. So thank you for being patient with me. November was an extremely busy month, and I started it, but I didn't have a chance to finish it the way I'd like to. So there you are. One last look at the Christmas tree. And I wish you, you know, very happy holiday season, a very healthy, prosperous new year, 2026, because of course health is wealth. And if there's anything that you would like me to go into a little bit further, maybe some of the topics that I brought up today, you would like to go into more, please let me know in the comment section. And until I see you the next time, remember to keep your liver and your colon clean. Bye-bye now. Thank you.